This is New Patriot Series number 40. We're going to discuss the ancient non-Christian literary witnesses to the existence of the historical Yeshua. The question of whether Jesus was a real person who ever lived has been brought up by many people in many different circumstances because the Jesus of the New Testament is not really a historical being. He's a kind of a mythical and legendary being. But there was a real Yeshua, and we can get information about him historically through various literary sources that do refer to his existence. And we have, of course, his teachings that can be recovered. And that's what I do. So the Jesus of the Gospels was legendary and mythic. But the man Jesus, or Yeshua, was historical, a historical person. Non-Christian historians and other writers of the early Christian period refer to the historical Yeshua in several instances. Scholars have found references to Yeshua from several extra-biblical early sources. And these are summarized in the article written by Lawrence Mikituk, his feature article from the January-February 2015 issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, entitled "Did Jesus Exist? Searching for Evidence Beyond the Bible," that I will refer to from now on with just the words "Did Jesus Exist?" in italics. Now, Mikituk holds a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic studies and serves as the history librarian at Purdue University. I will refer to his summary of evidence in this presentation. You can access it here through this URL if you wish to do so. So let's take a look at Mikituk's methodology and the methodology used by other scholars for this kind of research. Using archaeological evidence, Mikituk has been able to verify the historical existence of 53 people mentioned in the Bible. He cautions to use biblical data as a determining factor in interpreting an inscription, and then to claim that the inscription confirms the Bible opens the door to circular logic, he said. The historicity and the time and place of these people has to be confirmed in many different ways, but their existence needs to be confirmed by something outside of just the Bible. So he has a three-step method. Data is checked to make sure it's from an authentic inscription and not forged. Settings from historical documents are matched up to confirm that the person's time and socio-political place, such as the Kingdom of Judah, are the same. And Mikituk considers a period of about 50 years between the person in the inscription and the person in the Bible as permissible, because an adult could be active for that amount of time. There are at least three ways of identifying the individual in the Bible, such as the person's name, the father's name, the person's title, and these must match the same three identifying marks of the individual in an archaeological inscription. 3 identifying matches are considered a lock, 2 are considered a reasonable hypothesis, or even a likely hypothesis for a match, but 1 is not enough. The work of other scholars, if you're interested, is detailed in Professor Bart Ehrman's book called "Did Jesus Exist?", which I strongly recommend. So the first person we're going to look at in terms of literary sources is Gaius or Publius Cornelius Tacitus, known as Tacitus, who was born somewhere around 55-56 AD and died somewhere around 118. Now, his last major work was entitled The Annals, which was written about 116-117, describes Nero shifting blames to Christians for the fire he secretly ordered to burn down slums for his new building projects. These slums happened to be places where an awful lot of Roman Christians lived, as well as Jews. So therefore, says Tacitus, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of this name, Christ, or Christus in Latin, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for a time, the deadly superstition erupted again, not only in Judea, the origin of all this evil, but also in the city Rome, which he calls the city, where all things horrible and shameful from everywhere come together and become popular. Now, Mikituk and other people have presented this evidence, and the way that Mikituk describes the validity of this evidence is that he says that Tacitus presents 4 pieces of accurate knowledge about Jesus. 1, Christus, used by Tacitus to refer to Jesus, was one distinctive way by which some referred to him, even though Tacitus mistakenly took it for a personal name rather than an epithet or title. 2, this Christus, or Crestus, was associated with the beginning of the movement of Christians, whose name originated from his. 3, he was executed by the Roman governor of Judea. And 4, at the time of his death, this was during Pontius Pilate's governorship of Judea during the reign of Tiberius. So many New Testament scholars date Jesus' death to somewhere around 29 AD, or Christian era. Pilate governed Judea in AD 26 to 36, while Tiberius was emperor AD 14 to 37. So this is what you'll find in the article that Mikituk presents as good evidence that this is evidence for the historical existence of Yeshua. And hereafter I will cite this as just his article's name, Did Jesus Exist? Now, taking a look at Tacitus, earlier in his career, when Tacitus was proconsul of Asia, he likely supervised trials, questioned people accused of being Christians, and judged and punished those whom he found guilty, as his friend Pliny the Younger had done when he too was a provincial governor. Thus Tacitus stood a very good chance of becoming aware of information that he characteristically would have wanted to verify before accepting it as true. Tacitus also describes the horrors that Nero inflicted upon the Christians. He arranged as a mask entertainment for his political friends. He needed support because many people knew that Nero himself had set the fires, and many people strongly disapproved of this. So he entertained his friends sort of in the manner that Donald Trump entertains all of his supporters, with some kind of entertainment. In this case, it was a very ghoulish entertainment. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty to being Christians, and of course, that was the deal. You needed to confess Christ. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. This is Tacitus's description of what Nero did to the Christians. And this is probably why the 666 gematria for the Antichrist in Revelations, the book of Revelations, that has the number 666, is used, because it spells out the name Nero Caesar in both Aramaic and Hebrew gematria letters. Let's look at Flavius Josephus and his book called The Jewish Antiquities. This is the first reference in his writings. Titus Flavius Josephus, born Yosef ben Mattatyahu, was the first century Romano-Christian historian who was born in Jerusalem, then part of Roman Judea, to a father of priestly descent and a mother who claimed royal ancestry. You can take a look at the Wikipedia entry on Josephus. Now, Josephus originally had joined with the Essenes and the other partisans of the Jews in the revolution in AD 70. But when he was, according to descriptions, when he and his little phalanx of soldiers that he commanded were clearly defeated, and they had all decided upon suicide, and they drew straws, and somehow he arranged it so he got the shortest straw, or the longest straw, whatever it was, so he would be the last person to die. Then they divided into pairs, and each one killed the other, and the next one killed that one, and so on. And when they were all dead, instead of committing suicide, Josephus went out and surrendered to the Romans. And then he became very prosperous because he supported the Romans after they had defeated the Jewish Revolution. And he was supported in his work. And he wrote some incredible histories of the Jews because he wanted to present Judaism in as positive a way as possible. And that's why we have this, because Christian monks and churches took his writings and transmitted them through history, although they altered them in ways that they wanted things to read, or they added to them. We'll discuss that a bit later. So there are two authentic references to the historicity of Yeshua in Josephus's second work, the Jewish Antiquities, or Antiquities of the Jews. And one is generally recognized as a later Christian interpolation in his Jewish Wars, or the Wars of the Jews. The first reference that is considered to be authentic is found in the Jewish Antiquities. The shorter of these two references to Jesus is in Book 20, is incidental to identifying Jesus' brother James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. In the temporary absence of a Roman governor between Festus's death and the governor Albinus's arrival in 62 CE, the high priest Ananus instigated James' execution, and here's how Josephus describes the execution of James. Being therefore this kind of person, i.e. a heartless Sadducee, Ananus, thinking that he had a favorable opportunity because Festus had died and Albinus was still on his way, called a meeting, literally a Sanhedrin, of judges and brought into it the brother of Jesus, who is called Messiah, James by name, and some others. And he made the accusation they had transgressed the law, and they handed them over to be stoned. So this is the way that Josephus says that James died. He was stoned to death. Mikituk observes, many men named James are mentioned in Josephus' work, so Josephus needed to specify which one he meant. The common custom of simply giving the father's name, James, son of Joseph, would not work here because James' father's name was also very common. Therefore, Josephus identifies this James by reference to his famous brother, Jesus. But James' brother Jesus, Yehoshua or Yeshua, also had a very common name. So Josephus mentions at least one or two other men named Jesus in his writings. In order to clarify this Jesus, he specified which Jesus he is referring to by adding the phrase, who is called Messiah or Christ. Or since he was writing his name in Greek, Christos. You'll find that in Did Jesus Exist? Now this is considered authentic for two main reasons. The New Testament and Christian writers of the first 2 centuries consistently refer to James as the brother of the Lord or of the Savior, not the brother of Jesus, as Josephus does here. So it is very unlikely that this was a gloss that was written in by a Christian. And secondly, Josephus' version of the murder of James differs from the Christian version, in which he is thrown off the temple wall and beaten to death by a fuller. So this is an independent account of how James was murdered by Ananus. and who supposedly did it legally. So this is considered to be very likely to be historical and to be authentic. Now, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish Antiquities, has a second reference that's even more important. It's called the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, Book 18 of the Antiquities. The parts that are clearly later interpolations are shown as churches transmitted the manuscript are underlined, so I have shown them that way. I've underlined what is probably later Christian glosses. But this is what we find in the Testimonium Flavianum. Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed we're not to call him a man, for he was one who did surprising deeds and a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him, for on the third day he appeared to them restored to life, and the prophets of God had prophesied this and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not died out. But if we remove the likely Christian interpolations, an authentic historical reference to Yeshua can be recovered. And would go like this. This is probably what the passage actually read when Josephus wrote it before it was expanded by Christian writers or Christian monks or Christian scribes who transmitted the document. Probably like this. If we remove all this underlined stuff that we can obviously see was stuff that was interjected by Christian scribes, it reads like this. Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, which is the Greek word is sophos, which is for the Hebrew hakim, and that is how Yeshua is known in his time as an hakim, a righteous wise man. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of Christians, so called, have still to this day not died out. Now, one of the things that pptx says is that all surviving manuscripts of the Testimonium Flavianum are in Greek, and they're all the ones that are in Greek, like the original, contain the same version of this passage with no significant differences. Even more important, the short passage that mentions Jesus is done not to talk about Jesus, but in order to identify James in the earlier part. That short passage appears in a later section in the book, Book 20, implying that Jesus was mentioned previously. That's my emphasis. So this had to be a mention of Yeshua, because later on it refers back to this mention. Now, pptx correctly states almost all the following statements about Jesus, which are asserted in the New Testament, are corroborated or confirmed by the relevant passages in Tacitus and Josephus. These independent historical sources, one a non-Christian Roman historian and the other a Jewish historian, confirm what we are told in the Gospels as follows. So here are historians Tacitus and Josephus validating fragments of historical information that the Gospels transmit. So here's what they are. 1, he existed as a man. The historian Josephus grew up in a priestly family in first century Palestine and wrote only decades after Jesus' death. Jesus' known associates, such as Jesus' brother James, were his contemporaries. The historical and cultural context was second nature to Josephus. His implicit affirmation is a very important witness to this. If any Jewish writer were ever in a position to know about the non-existence of Jesus, it would have been Josephus. But his implicit affirmation of the existence of Jesus has been, and still is, the most significant obstacle for those who argue that the extra biblical evidence is not probative on this point. This is an observation made by Robert Van Voorst. And Tacitus was careful enough not to report real executions of non-existent people. His personal name was Yeshua, as Josephus informs us. He was called Christos in Greek, which is a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, both of which mean anointed or the anointed one, as Josephus states and Tacitus implies, unaware, by reporting, as the Romans thought, that his name was Christus or Crustus. He had a brother named James, Jacob, as Josephus reports. He won over both Jews and Greeks, i.e. the Gentiles of the Hellenistic culture, according to Josephus, though it's anachronistic to say that there were many at the end of his life, because large growth in the number of Yeshua's actual followers came only after his death. And Jewish leaders of the day expressed unfavorable opinions about him, at least according to some versions of the Testimonium Flavianum. Pilate rendered the decision that he should be executed, as both Tacitus and Josephus state. His execution was specifically by crucifixion, according to Josephus, and he was executed during Pontius Pilate's governorship over Judea, somewhere between 26 and 36, as Josephus implies and Tacitus states, adding that it was during Tiberius's reign. So all of these things are historical fragments that we find in the Gospels that are accurate historical information that can be validated by non-Christian historians. So let's look at some of the others. There's Lucian of Samosata, who lived from somewhere around AD 115 to 200. He was a Greek satirist who wrote The Passing of Peregrinus. Now, Peregrinus, who was Peregrinus? Well, he was a former Christian who later became a famous cynic and a revolutionary and died in about AD 165. In two sections of his satire of the passing of Peregrinus or Peregrinus, Lucian, while discussing Peregrinus's career, without naming Jesus, clearly refers to him, albeit with contempt, in the midst of satire, as pptx says in Did Jesus Exist? It was then that he learned, says Lucian, the marvelous wisdom of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine, and what else? In short order, he made them look like children, for he was a prophet, cult leader, head of the congregation, and everything all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books and wrote many himself. They revered him as a god, used him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector, to be sure, after that other whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced this new cult into the world. So here is Lucian's reference in his satire to this man who was crucified in Palestine, and we know that his reference is to the Christians and to, therefore, Jesus. For having convinced themselves that they are going to be immortal and live forever, the poor wretches despise death and even most willingly give themselves up. Furthermore, their first lawgiver, that would be Yeshua, persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another, after they have transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living according to his laws. And again, here Jesus is called a sophist. I'm put down here a picture from the Loeb Classical Library translations of Lucian, that you can get, and this translation is by Craig Evans. It's a good translation. So if you're interested, you can look and find him probably online. So, although Lucian was aware of the Christians' books, some of which might have been parts of the New Testament, his many bits of misinformation make it seem very likely that he did not read them. The compound term priests and scribes, for example, seems to have been borrowed from Judaism, and indeed Christianity and Judaism were sometimes confused among the classical authors. Lucian seems to have gathered all of his information from sources independent of the New Testament and other Christian writings. And for this reason, this writing of his is usually valued as independent evidence for the existence of Jesus. That's what pptx says. I'm quoting him here in his article, Did Jesus Exist? And it's another bit of literary witness that we find from that period of time. There are several other non-Christian Hellenistic writers who opposed Christianity, and they also can serve as witnesses to the historicity of Yeshua. Here are some of them that are of interest. Amara bar Serapion was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria, right adjacent to the area where Yeshua preached and where many Christians lived. He is noted for a letter he wrote in Syriac to his son, who was also named Serapion. The letter was composed sometime after 73 AD, but before the 3rd century, and most scholars date it to shortly after AD 73 during the 1st century. The letter may be an early non-Christian reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. Here's what he says. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. He's talking about Socrates and Pythagoras, who were also wise men who were unjustly killed, like the king of the Jews. And he pointed out that the Athenians, who tried and demanded the execution of Socrates, they died of hunger. The Samians, who convicted Pythagoras of being a criminal, were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. So that's his reference, and that's where this mention of the wise king who was executed by the Jews. Pliny the Younger, in his letter to Trajan about 112 AD, about how to deal with the Christian cult that, quote, meets on a certain day before light where they gather and sing hymns to Christ as to a god. This letter to Trajan, the implication might be that Christ was not a god but a man, because he says they sing hymns to Christ, which he thinks of as a personal name, Christus, as to a god, implying that he wasn't a god, but they thought he was a god. Suetonius was a Roman writer, lawyer, and historian who was contemporary with Pliny the Younger, wrote about an expulsion from Rome of Jews because of disturbances instigated by a certain Chrestus during the reign of Claudius, AD 41 to 54, and also punishments by Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher and an opponent of early Christianity, known for his literary work on the true doctrine. He knew Christianity, its gospels, and practices. So he had taken a great deal and many pains to really educate himself about his opponents whom he attacked. In an attack on Justin Martyr's writings, he never claimed that Jesus didn't exist, but said his miracles, which he considered to be historical, by the way, were done by magic that Jesus had studied in Egypt. He also accused the Christians of not following the Jewish practices that the historical Jesus followed. So there's a lot there. If you want to look into the writings of these people, you can read more and get a better idea of how that was presented. Now, the final thing we'll look into is something that may be an archaeological witness. It's called the James Ossuary. The James Ossuary is an authentic 1st century limestone box that was used for containing the bones of the dead. It was found in the Kidron Valley adjacent to Jerusalem. An Aramaic inscription in the Hebrew alphabet reading James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, is cut into one side of the box. You can kind of make it out there. It's written in an Aramaic and Hebrew script. The inscription is considered significant because if genuine, it might provide archaeological evidence for Jesus of Nazareth's existence. However, while the ossuary itself is accepted as authentic to the time period, the 1st century, the inscription itself could be a modern forgery or a Middle Age forgery, possibly by the owner, Oded Golan, who's an Israeli engineer and antiquities collector who bought and owns the box, or by someone else who had it in its possession at an earlier time and wanted to raise its value on the antiquity market, and so had that inscription put onto the box. The existence of the ossuary was announced at an October 21st, 2002 Washington press conference co-hosted by the Discovery Channel and the Biblical Archaeological Society. The initial translation of the inscription was done by André Lemaire, who is a Semitic epigrapher whose article claiming that the ossuary and its inscription were authentic was published in the November-December 2002 Biblical Archaeological Review. In 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority, the IAA, argued that the inscriptions were forged at a much later date than the 1st century. And in December 2004, Oded Golan was charged with 44 counts of forgery, fraud, and deception, including forgery of the ossuary inscription. The trial lasted 7 years before Judge Aaron Farkash came to a verdict. On March 14, 2012, Golan was acquitted of the forgery charges, but convicted of illegal trading in antiquities. There was a tremendous amount of political stuff going on around this, with interference from American fundamentalists and all kinds of Christian fundamentalists and Jewish people and all kinds of things. The judge said that this acquittal, quote, does not mean that the inscription on the ossuary is authentic or that it was written 2,000 years ago. So the ossuary was returned to Golan, who owns it and has put it on public display and makes money from it that way. So further scholarly research is needed to determine whether the James ossuary inscription is authentic or a forgery. At this time, scholars do not invoke it as an archaeological evidence for the existence of either James or Jesus, but that may change in the future. So you might want to keep your eyes peeled for articles about this in the future.